Hello, everybody. My name is Teo Yu Yen, and I'm one of the editors of Academia SG. Welcome to Academia SG Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series. If this is the first time you're attending one of our webinars, welcome. If you've been following this series, thank you for your support and welcome back. Our speaker today is Jin Yao. Jin Yao recently completed his PhD in social welfare at UCLA and is now a postdoctoral fellow in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. Many of you may also know Jin Yao from his website and podcast, cialservice.sg, in which he discusses many issues relating to social service practice and research. His presentation today draws from his work in that space and is titled Podcast for Research and Public Engagement in Singapore. After Jin Yao speaks for 30 minutes, we will hear comments from Professor Kenneth Paul Tan. Professor Tan will be a familiar name to most of you, given his vast and wide-ranging body of work on Singapore over many years, as well as his profile as a public intellectual. Professor Tan is Professor of Politics, Film and Cultural Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University, and his most recent books include Movies to Save Our World, Imagining Poverty, Inequality and Environmental Destruction in the 21st Century, just published by Penguin, and another book titled Singapore's First Year of COVID-19, published by Palgrave Macmillan. I should also mention that Prof. Tan has been extremely supportive of Academia SG right from the beginning of our founding, participating in many of our events in various capacities. And we're very pleased and grateful that he's once again agreed to lend his expertise and support as a discussant today. Thank you, Kenneth. So after Jin Yao and Kenneth speak, we will have about 20 minutes for a Q&A with audience members. Please note that this session is recorded and live streamed. To minimize distractions, we ask that you turn off your microphones and cameras while the speakers are speaking. Okay, with that, I would like to turn this over to Jin Yao.
Thank you, Yu Yan. A very good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. Before I begin and before I share my slides, I just wanted to first express my appreciation to academia.sg for creating this seminar space for junior scholars like myself. In particular, thank you to Ms. Corrie Tan for doing the heavy lifting administratively and to Dr. Kenneth Paul Tan for agreeing to serve as discussant. Right, so let me share my slides. Give me a few seconds to do that. Okay, I'm gonna change my screen. Right, you should be able to see my slides. So let me know if you don't. So my name is Jin Yao. Some of you know me as Kwan. I'm currently a social work postdoctoral fellow at the University of Denver. Today, I've titled my seminar Podcast for Research and Public Engagement in Singapore with a focus on the study of civic engagement, community engagement, and political participation in the context of COVID-19 and GE 2020, that is the 2020 general election in Singapore. Right. I've organized the seminar in 4 sections, right? I'll first give the lay of the land, speaking to the growth in podcasts for research, practice, policy, and education. Then in the second and third sections, I draw from 2 of my research papers which use and analyze podcast episodes as data, right? So they explore youth civic and community engagement during the 2020 COVID-19 circuit breaker, the very first one, as well as youth civic and political participation during and beyond GE 2020. And then in the final section, I'll reflect more thoroughly on the use of podcasts for research and public engagement with an emphasis on practice, policy, and education. So let's talk about the growth in podcasts first. Right, the growth in the supply of and demand for podcasts has been pretty staggering, right? So around the world, there are about 4 million podcast shows, 80 million episodes, and 400 million listeners, right? These listening trends are also mirrored in Singapore, where it is estimated that about 16.5% of those aged 16 to 64 listen to podcasts each week for about 56 minutes each day. Within research and academia, it must be said that the study of podcasts is not new, right? Existing literature has documented how podcasts can be used for teaching, for student learning, and for researchers to communicate their research findings to the public. Within my social work field as well, we've been exploring podcasts for interventions and therapy use also. But what I think is there has been a slight change in the past few years. I think we are increasingly acknowledging the specific features which make podcasts compelling for research and education. So these are accessibility, which means you can listen and distribute the podcast anywhere, anytime. Creation and production in real time, which is pretty critical, which means speed, and you're capturing opinions and perspectives as events are unfolding. And finally, customization, which means podcast episodes can serve multiple functions, as I hope to illustrate today. And to me, a key implication of this is that the potential of the podcast is not limited to critical teaching and learning within the classroom. I'm trying to make the case that in addition to education, podcasts can be used for research, practice, and policy too. And this is where I segue into the cialservice.sg podcast, right? So on the left is the cover of the first season, it's COVID-19 Community Chronicles. And on the right is our second season, the 9 days, because that was the length, and that is the length of most general election campaign periods in Singapore, right? So I actually started the podcast in 2019. I actually started the website in 2019 to explore social service policies, research, and practice in Singapore. But the podcast actually came along during the first circuit breaker. So in the first season from April 9 to June 24, 2020, we had guests who were running community initiatives. If you remember, at that point in time, there was a lot of activity, some of whom also talked about structural or systemic issues they were observing while running their initiatives. Then in the second season, very much an extension, from about June 30th to July 11, we solicited youth views on election issues and candidates and their thoughts on the election. What was important was that we were capturing those views in real time. So you didn't have folks who are pontificating about, oh, the results came out one way, the outcomes were one way, and reflecting in retrospect. They were reflecting on the election as the election was going on. And with that in mind, I just want to share my thoughts on the potential of podcast usage for research, practice, policy, and education, right? It's going to be a fair bit on the next slide here, but I'm going to take you step by step, and I'll come back to these reflections on podcasts, on research and public engagement. Let me give you a brief overview for each first, right? So if you look at the top left-hand corner with research, they can be used as research data, as I'll demonstrate later today. I think in addition to using them as research data, you can be used as forms to condense and communicate journal articles and publications, or in certain instances also to use to respond to criticism or pushback in the public. For practice, on the top right-hand corner, here I'm thinking about my social work field, but it could really apply to other applied fields as well. Podcasts could help democratize and communicate practice sharing and insights, promote practice research partnerships, and facilitate advocacy or community change. Similarly, for policy too, on the bottom left-hand corner, advocacy could likewise be facilitated. Podcasts could also be used to communicate parliamentary work, as well as gather views for research and practice also. And then finally, as we've established so far, podcasts could guide or supplement classroom discussions, could have students create episodes, and also have teachers and students feature as guests in those episodes as well to facilitate learning and further communication also. So let me start with the research piece in terms of using and analyzing podcast episodes as data. Right. Before I go on to that, some considerations and limitations related to methodology to set the stage in terms of podcasts for research. The benefits of having podcast episodes as data would include, number one, timing, because guests, as I mentioned, describe their engagement or participation as events are happening. So as 2020 circuit breaker was happening, we weren't quite fully cognizant and understanding the virus itself. Podcast guests were describing their involvement at that point in time as the virus was wreaking havoc. And during the 9-day G 2020, the youth participants and guests did not know about the results yet. So they weren't guessing about they were guessing about the outcomes, but they weren't speaking with the benefit of hindsight in that sense. Another benefit here is that because all the reference episodes are public in those published articles, folks could potentially compare my analysis or any analysis with the episode. So you could listen to the episodes in real time and see if my analysis actually, if they do make sense, and review or challenge the findings thereafter as well. Now, with benefits that come with limitations as well. So one limitation, which I think is an important one, is selection bias. It's a threat because if you think about the type or the person or personality who's likely to become podcast guests, speaking to a public audience. They're more likely to be very confident orators. They're very active participants. I also think about some ethical concerns. So in terms of using podcast episodes as data and limited social demographic information collected. So if you think about traditional qualitative methods such as an interview or focus group, I could potentially ask about social demographics like socioeconomic status, education background, but with the podcast episodes, we only had their age and sex or gender, which limits additional analysis if you're interested in contrasting participation and engagement forms based on those demographic data also, right? So here I want to demonstrate how I've used and analyzed podcast episodes from cialservice.sg in 2 journal articles. The first relates to youth civic and community engagement during the 2020 COVID-19 lockdown. The full article will be published soon, so if you're interested to get a copy, you can drop me an email in the next few weeks when it's out. So some background first. We know quite intimately right now that disasters like the pandemic have adversely affected young adults around the world, and that many have been engaged civically and in the community in spite of these difficulties. And many of these youths as well, we know that they see and experience the disproportionate socioeconomic fallout on disadvantaged communities. Singapore's not unique in that sense. And that has led them to not only be involved in different forms of initiatives, but also question systems and structures which may have rendered those communities vulnerable in the first place. However, in the Singaporean context and beyond, I was interested in 3 additional things, right? Number 1, I was interested in the motivations of young adults to be involved. Second, what those civic and community engagement processes look like, especially when you think about physical and social distancing in place. And then third, thinking about them being involved in this period, what are the longer term social political implications of their engagement during that circuit breaker period as well. And I drew from the COVID-19 Community Chronicle season, talking to those who led or volunteered for organizations or initiatives. So with data collection during the episodes, I chose not to take an antagonistic approach. So I rarely challenged the guests. None of the episodes were edited for content. The way the questions and interviews were structured was semi-structured, and they largely revolved around how folks got started, what the team and organizational dynamics were over time, as well as challenges and plans for the future. And then with data analysis, I went with thematic analysis. I'm happy to speak about the methodology and coding process in greater detail during question and answer. So here's what I found in terms of a chronological process. I'm going to take you through the diagram because I know that's a fair bit here. So first, if you look at the first row, these 5 themes are chronologically related. So the first, what we saw from the data itself and the episodes were that the pandemic and lockdown were triggers. So folks said mai tulia, with folks really adjusting to government measures. It feels like an eternity ago, but they were adjusting to things like DOSCON becoming orange, and then were matching the speed of the lockdown announcement because it came fairly quickly in the initial phases as well. In the second step, in the second theme with motivations, the young adults in our sample saw and experienced community needs and wished to do something in response. As one of the respondents said, what used to be invisible, it's now really visible, right? And this led to the next theme or step with online mobilization. So quote, one of them said, everything has been taking place over social media or over online chat groups, right? Initiatives were either started or moved online. We had different volunteer teams that were built online virtually, and they also communicated with their own community members over the internet as well. And with online mobilization subsequently, tweaking the platforms and building our masters was about folks taking action, right? So over time, it was apparent in our sample as well that they demonstrated a great deal of introspection in terms of evaluating their own initiatives, adjusting their initiatives, thinking, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? They were working across different initiatives and needs because they saw that there were multiple people in the same community. And then what was interesting also that we were really interested in centering community members. So letting folks take over, right? Not making sure that the volunteers and the individuals themselves were not the center of attention. They were yielding a lot more space to community members at that point in time, over time also. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit more time on this final theme about making use of the crisis with future directions and how young adults perceive this final theme. So what was interesting here was that respondents broadly agreed, there was broad agreement that the social economic challenges we've been seeing in the context of the pandemic, they are interconnected, right? However, The respondents differed on the extent to which they thought structural problems were pervasive, which also meant they differed in terms of how they framed their initiatives vis-a-vis the government. So there were two distinct approaches, which shouldn't be surprising, but there were two distinct approaches from the data. The first group, so they saw community needs and initiatives as evidence that the government should have done more before the pandemic, right? On the other hand, others thought that government policies were adequate. They have been really adequate, and their own initiatives were just plugging specific gaps that the government might have missed out. I'm going to show you two excerpts from the podcast episodes, right? So there are two quotes here illustrating the distinction. The first, on the left-hand side, quote, "People have been facing financial and physical troubles since long before COVID-19 started. And arguably, if we had reached out to each other earlier to look after each other and to make sure that the government is looking after everybody equally, then we have been a lot more resilient for this crisis." Then on the second one, which illustrates the second approach, the second quote, "Is there still value in doing this? Because if the government is already providing a one-time relief, we might not need to come in." He goes on to explain that the government's COVID-19 measures were quote unquote robust enough, and the challenge was more about getting the information out there and communicating to families that the help is out there, and we need to plug that information gap with the government together. So a few insights and implications to round up this section, right? Unsurprisingly, the speed of youth mobilization, online mobilization in Singapore when the pandemic first struck in April, March 2020 is consistent with what we've observed around the world. Interestingly, also over time, they were not just focused on their own initiatives and projects, but championed collaboration, community building, and the centering of community members, right? So a reasonable implication here is that these expressions of solidarity and recognition of interconnectedness is likely to shape continued civic and community engagement in the country. Nevertheless, these forms and approaches of youth civic and community engagement are not going to be homogeneous, right? In the context of such engagement leading folks to challenge or support the social political status quo, there are some who will advocate for more structural changes and who are more likely to be skeptical of government policies. Conversely, those who perceive government policies to be adequate could be more willing to work with the government. Now, this is not likely to be a dichotomy of oppositions or support, right? And I think future studies should illustrate a spectrum, I believe, of engagement forms. And I also think it's likely to vary based on the types of issues and policies we're talking about. But I think this will be a starting point in considering that spectrum of engagement and participation forms for the future. So, oops. And then the second journal article, also using podcast episodes as data, relates to youth civic and political participation during and beyond GE 2020, right? So this, you could see this as an extension of the first season, because GE 2020 happened, had overlaps with the first circuit breaker. Now, if you scan the QR code there, you'll be able to access the article. This is an open access article where I review podcast episodes as data, but in the context of the GE 2020 season as well. Right, so this feels like an eternity ago, but Singapore, we were one of the earliest countries to hold elections under pandemic lockdown, right? COVID-19, of course, was the big electoral focus, but a range of other social economic challenges were of interest too at the point in time. The biggest difference with the pandemic election vis-a-vis other elections in the past was, of course, the mode of campaigning, right? Instead of having huge physical rallies, the lockdown and physical distancing measures meant that folks were consuming and producing political content virtually. And it is against this background that I was particularly interested in how young voters were engaging and what that meant for future forms of political and civic participation. And of course here, the procedures for data collection and analysis was similar to the previous section, but the podcast season was now the 9 days. In conversations with young voters, we primarily discussed their motivations to be involved, participation forms, and future plans in terms of their involvement in the future. And here's a summary of the findings. I'll take you through that as well. A lot to pass through, but basically what we found from the data itself that you could categorize youth motivations in two forms as either building awareness and activism, framed as revitalizing democracy, or taking action, right? And these forms of civic and political participation happened before GE 2020 and during the election, and before GE 2020 and between GEs. And then of course, the second form would be during GE 2020 itself. Now, in both instances, before GE 2020 and during the election itself, the forms of building awareness and activism were built through the consumption and production of content, right? Between elections, the youth acted through correspondence with political leaders, or they were directly involved in events. And then during GE 2020 itself, they were deeply involved in engaging parties. And of course, some of them also did direct party volunteerism. Across the board, what we were documenting here is that respondents were really involved in a range of conventional and non-conventional, otherwise understood as electoral and non-electoral activities, and they transitioned into or expanded their online participation without difficulty. So there are these different forms of motivations and participation, but they were able to move in between forms quite easily during the general election period in 2020. So some overview of the findings and extending that, right? Any form of civic and political participation we found during GE 2020 resulted in respondent resolve to continue or expand their engagement after GE 2020. So in the sample, respondents were stressing that participation should not only occur during elections, and that building awareness and activism and taking action were mutually reinforcing motivations. And then those who consume and produced political content during GE 2020, they were committed to acting even after the election, while those already involved in action in the second half resolved to harness and take advantage of heightened interest in the politics of other youths who they perceived to be not as involved as them or as engaged as they were during GE 2020. So one quote to illustrate this, I think this sentiment is nicely summarized by this quote by one of the interviews in the podcast. Over the decades, he said, we have developed the kind of mentality that politics only matters during election campaigns. We just have this frenzy of political activity for 1 or 2 weeks, and then everybody goes back to what they were doing before that. Other respondents also had similar expressions and resolutions. So they said things along the lines of democracy and active citizenship are not just about the elections. Your vote does not just die after polling day. Learning about politics does not just happen during elections. And it is a mistake to think that elections or democracy are only a once in a 5 years affair. And a few insights and implications to conclude this section. So first, both between elections and during GE 2020, awareness and activism were built through the consumption and production of predominantly online content. And during the election, COVID-19 and post-pandemic recovery were especially prominent issues of interest. And unsurprisingly, respondents transitioned seamlessly to online forms of social media and internet participation. The second key finding implication here is that as COVID-19, the pandemic, increased digital engagement, the youth in this study emphasized the importance of civic and political participation beyond elections per se, which signaled a continued mix of online, offline, conventional, electoral, and non-conventional, non-electoral participation. Respondents diversified their participation because they were aware of the limitations of each of the participation forms. And then finally, we saw, as in the previous slide, civic and political participation during the pandemic election resulted in respondent resolve to continue to expand their engagement in the long term. In particular, they saw building awareness and activism and acting or taking action as mutually reinforcing motivations beyond GE 2020. So far, we've talked about podcasts for research and specifically on podcast episodes as data. Now, in this final section, I want to reflect on the use of podcasts for, as I promised, research and public engagement with the emphasis on practice, policy, and education. So I'll just talk about this briefly first because we saw the first 2 seasons, so including the first 2 seasons on COVID-19 lockdown and GE 2020, since 2020, when we started in April 2020, we've produced about 100 episodes, which can be broadly categorized as such. So I'm trying to share here that there have been additional episodes and seasons since then, and these episodes that followed since COVID-19 and the 9 days have taken these 3 different forms, right? So the first big one would be making research sense. So in these podcast episodes, we talk to researchers and academics and writers on their publications, their books, and public reports. So we've covered primarily social economic issues that includes the minimum wage, food insecurity, poverty and inequality, minimum income standards, mental health and happiness, climate change, online harassment, labor conditions, and migrant workers. So that's one big bucket here. The second big bucket is civic engagement and action. So this includes interviews with and on civil society groups, efforts, and issues. There is definitely some overlap with the issues I mentioned just now, but here, beyond just publicizing the groups, we're also interested in their growth, their process, and plans for the future, right? There have been a few other mini-series we've done so far as well. They include one specific to social workers, futures thinking, and reflecting on the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic 1 year later. even though we're very much still in the middle of it. And there's one more thing I should mention here, which I did not include in the slide, is something I referenced earlier with both the COVID-19 episodes and the G2020 episodes, in terms of not taking an antagonistic approach or challenging the guests during the episode. So, there's room for disagreement here, but the tone or the way in which we do the interviews is very conversational, very interview focused, and that in itself has its pros and cons. And so I'm happy to take questions about those interview and conversational approaches also. So we've seen this diagram earlier, which documents my reflections on podcast usage for research, practice, policy, and education. However, I think it's important to not just review research, practice, policy, and education as kind of individual domains, but to draw connections in relation to the potential of the podcast medium for these different domains. And if you bear with me here, I've been thinking of framing podcasts for research and public engagement in this manner. I know it's a little corny, but given the water metaphorical reference and the alliteration, but here's how I'm starting to think about how we can use podcasts for research and more for public engagement, right? In terms of podcasts as catchments, as channels, and as confluence. And I'm going to take each of them in turn and expand upon what we've seen so far and the potential of the usage for the future. And also I'm going to draw not just from my own podcast, but from some of the other podcasts we've seen in Singapore as well. So most fundamentally, with podcasts as catchments, I'm seeing podcasts and podcast episodes functioning as repositories for information and data, right? It's not a new concept because I'm reminded that historians have used oral history to record interviews of personal recollections, familiar experiences, and significant past events, right? In Singapore, what comes to mind are the Singapore Queer Oral History Podcast, which documents stories of queer Singaporean folks. The History of Singapore was probably one of the earliest history-based podcasts in the country, though since then we've seen a number of others, including event-specific limited series such as Aware Saga podcast. Now, given that we can always build upon, review, and use these podcast episodes, it's no surprise, as we've seen in the beginning, that podcasts have been most widely used in classroom teaching and learning, right? But in addition to that, I've kind of demonstrated that there are advantages associated with using podcast episodes as research data. And I think also podcasts could be useful extensions for researchers to engage with the public. In another way, the podcast does not have to live behind a paywall, and researchers don't have to wait for the mainstream media to pick up research findings which may have practice or policy implications, right? And then to round up this concept of podcasts as catchments or reservoirs of information and data, in the Singaporean social work context, which I'm familiar with, podcasts such as Social Work Made Accessible and the Leah podcast, which are run by social work students and educators, they've created additional spaces for rich conversations on social work and social policies. So that's the first one with podcasts as channels, as catchments. Then with podcasts as channels, we're thinking beyond and not just collecting information and data, but using podcast episodes to communicate, facilitate, exchange across research, practice, policy, and education. To me, this is one step ahead of just putting content out there to actually engage with current issues and engage in conversation, right? So for instance, I think an earlier mistake I made with cialservice.sg was to just feature or profile nonprofits and social initiatives without pushing them further to talk about how the founders or representatives or volunteers position their work vis-a-vis other efforts or within Singapore's social political landscape, right? All these efforts and initiatives, they are well-intentioned. I think we've reached the point where a little bit more rigor is needed. So it's not just about talking, oh, tell me how you got started, what's your progress so far, but actually pushing founders and initiatives to think about where do they position themselves in this landscape of providing assistance and aid in Singapore. So in the past year on the podcast, we've also invited researchers not just talk about their research findings, but to also respond to criticisms and reviews of their work in the public. So to me, that's a really easy extension, right? Because researchers are already used to engaging with their peers in conversation through journal articles. And now the podcast platform feels like an opportunity to involve and engage the public, right? Increasingly too, what we've really enjoyed doing is to push researchers to actually articulate the practice and policy implications of their work and to have them dialogue with practitioners. So in other words, it's striving to answer, especially for research related to social issues, the so what question, right? So over time, consistent with the metaphor of a channel between practice and education, we're also interested in how teacher and student perspectives may in turn influence social work or applied field practice and reflections associated with it. So that's podcast as channels. And finally, looking at podcasts as CONFLUENCE. Oops. If you think about podcasts as catchments and channels, this should lead to the notion of confluence, because podcasts here offer a broader platform for advocacy and collective discussion of issues. What comes to mind most immediately here is practitioners advocating for sector or community change, as well as researchers helping to facilitate these forms of activism. Right. From a policy perspective on cialservice.sg, we've seen how podcasts can be used to communicate parliamentary work and gather research and practice views, right? For example, in the past few years or months, social work-related concerns have increasingly converged around the issues of professionalization, pay and compensation, burnout and retention, as well as case management and caseload. And here, what we've done is to engage with policymakers as well as social workers to talk about these issues in greater detail. Over the longer term, I think there is also a potential to create an audience and build an engaged community. I say this because I'm fully aware that cialservice.sg is fairly niche in terms of our focus on social policies and issues, right? And in Singapore, around the world, even though podcasts related to entertainment, comedy, and the popular media really make up the lion's share of listens in Singapore and around the world, we've actually seen our listenership grow quite steadily in the past 2 years. And what we also found is that folks who start listening to episodes stick around for the content and future content as well. And this feels like an open space for folks to engage in this space, to take advantage of its potential for future work. And it feels like an open space with plenty of future opportunities for folks who want to work across these different domains also. Right, I'm aware of the timing as well. So before I end, I just want to summarize the main points and findings and implications from the sharing today. The left-hand side features the substantive findings using podcast episodes as research data. And the right-hand side summarizes podcast usage for research and public engagement. So first, on the left-hand side with the substantive findings, the first is that with the podcast data and through the 2 articles, we found that among young Singaporeans, there's been significant demonstrations of civic engagement and political participation during the 2020 circuit breaker and GE 2020. Second, and relatedly, this involvement seems likely to sustain over time, with documented long-term muscle memory for subsequent mobilization and action, community building centering community members, and the honing of skills for digital and social media engagement. And then the third one is that these forms of involvement is not homogeneous. We spent some time illustrating the distinct approaches to government engagement, which I think is likely to run along a spectrum. And my broader sensing here is that there remains a large number of youth and young adults in Singapore who remains to be engaged. So they've not really been meaningfully engaged or have participated in different forms of activities. And there's a fairly large number of young Singaporeans who fall into that category. Now, on the right-hand side, with research and public engagement, trying to make the case that podcasts could function as catchments, channels, and confluence. With catchments, we're referring to how podcast episodes can function as information and data repositories for a multitude of different users. Podcasts as channels refer to podcasts for communication and exchange across different domains, thinking about research, practice, policy, and education. And then finally, I think where we're moving towards is podcasts as confluence, which refer to the offering of a broader platform for advocacy and better collective discussion of different issues in Singapore. And with that, thank you, but I'm just excited to hear your thoughts, but if I may, I'd like to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion as well. I'm sharing my email address there. Also, if you're interested to access the articles, our podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all streaming platforms. And you can also visit cialservice.sg/podcast. We also have an accompanying monthly newsletter, and you can subscribe at tinyletter.com/cialservice.sg. Yep. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jin Yao, for sharing that. I'd now like to invite Professor Kenneth Paul Tan to give his comments. Kenneth?
Thanks so much, Yoyan, and thanks, Jin Yao, for that terrific presentation. I was very excited to hear so many things that you can do with the podcast. And I think you've really presented to us a wide-ranging discussion that in many ways spirals out rather tantalizingly from, I guess, 2 focal points, right? The academic potential of podcasts, but also something that you might broadly describe as youth activism. And there's so many different ways, I guess, I could respond to your presentation, but I think I would like to at least begin by looking at it as, above all, your vision at this early stage of your career of the kind of academic that you want to be or you want to become, right? And it seems to me this is a vision of an academic who values equally the tasks of research, teaching, and making broader societal impact, and making this impact not just by commenting as a public intellectual, but actually being and acting in society as an agent of change. That's actually quite remarkable for this day and age, right? I think it's also a vision of an academic that views these tasks of research, teaching, and making impact not as separate realms of activity, but as continuous and mutually reinforcing aspects of a vocation, right? That many of us view as noble, but a vocation that is very easily degraded, not least, of course, by the neoliberalization of higher education and the political limits that are placed on academic freedoms increasingly. It seems to me a vision of an academic with something of an expansive or an expanding agenda, driven by intellectual curiosity, a spirit of experimentation, and a desire, I think, to make scholarship count well beyond bureaucratic metrics and all that. And I think that's something to be congratulated. And I would like to congratulate you on the breadth of vision and the ambition that I think drives it. Now, in your presentation, I see a lot that is strongly suggestive of future strands of very productive, very exciting, and socially impactful research. And I want to maybe point to just a few more fundamental questions around thinking about the podcast in research. And you're very welcome, of course, to respond if you like. At the heart of this is the podcast as methodology, right? Podcast as method. And I'm really curious to know your thoughts. I mean, you do sort of outline them in your presentation on the real practical similarities and differences with regard to the traditional methods that we're all familiar with in interviews, focus group discussions, oral history. These are very familiar approaches. But what exactly are the advantages of doing research the podcast way? You mentioned timing. You mentioned something about the archival possibilities of public podcasts. I think I heard you say. But what can you really do with podcasts that you cannot do with interviews and FGDs and oral history, right? And I guess the question is a practical one, because podcasts are difficult to do. I mean, they're costly, right? They're expensive. I think they're expensive. They're practically difficult. And you require a certain commitment to produce a podcast and maintain a regular podcast show. So there's a significant amount of investment. What would justify this amount of investment in terms of the research advantages? And then maybe something about the disadvantages. You've mentioned selection bias, and I think you said some ethical considerations, which are not trivial. But what about, how should I put this? Maybe the accuracy of the response in the sense that your guests or guests on podcasts generally would probably be quite self-conscious of the fact that they are addressing a potentially large and scarily invisible audience, right? And so they're likely to manage their answers more carefully. They want to say the right things, right? So, I mean, are they going to be very performative in their response to you? Will they give you PR-friendly answers? Will they be open to self-reflection? Will they talk about their weaknesses, their failures? Will they do all these things, which is valuable, right? Or will they give you a glossy account of how things are? A rosy and a more pleasant picture of youth activism. How do you overcome these kinds of non-trivial considerations, right? So that's, I guess, on the subject of audience. Maybe a third point could be on the audience itself. Now, I didn't hear you say anything, I think, about the audience, right? But it strikes me that the audience is important in this, however you want to analogize it, right? The audience seems important. I mean, not just in the sense of what can the like, share, and subscribe data tell us, although that itself can tell us something, but also the comments that your listeners make in the chat boxes and all that. That's rich data, right? And it's conversations that go on in parallel with, sometimes asynchronously, with the show conversation that goes on. And there must be something important in that. I mean, in a sense, they're not just your listeners or followers, but they're your fans, right? And the fans constitute a kind of community as well. I mean, and you know, there's a whole bunch of research done on fandom and that sort of those sorts of considerations that have a political dimension, a public participatory dimension, a social dimension. I think it's worth looking at that area a bit more. Okay, maybe let's think about the content creators, right? They're really influencers most of the time. And I don't know if you look at yourself as an influencer too. And influencers are often motivated by, you know, a variety of things, including commercial gain. And they use their personalities and their networks to very often work with businesses and governments, right, to market products and to market policies. So how do we, you know, if we're going to take what you say and expand it across the landscape of podcasts, how can we extract genuine data from what could potentially be just advertising or propaganda, right? And on the subject of expanding what you say to the larger landscape, I think at the end you said that, you know, a lot of what you're saying refers very specifically to your podcast, and that's fair enough. But it could also, you know, it could also apply to that range of podcasts that we find just in Singapore alone. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. I listen to 3 regularly. I listen to the Daily Catch Up, for example, which is, you know, helmed by a panel of 4 to 5 regular presenters. Sometimes they have guests. They are set up to react to news headlines, events, policies. You know, each person takes a different point of view and they occupy different positions in a debate. Their target audience seems to be millennials to Gen Zs. They effect a certain kind of authenticity in their dialogue. There's irreverence, there's humor. There's a video version, there's an audio version. The YouTube comments are very lively, you know, and sometimes they have sponsored content, right? The second one is Yala But, which I also listen to. Dialogue between 2 regular presenters, sometimes with guests. They also react to news headlines, events, policies, use a lot of humor. Target audience is a bit older, Gen X, I think, to millennial. They have an audio-only presence, but importantly, they have a subreddit community that's very, very lively, right? And they often drive the agenda and the themes and the questions for the show. They also do sponsored content sometimes, and a new narrative, of course, right? Guests are invited to talk about mainly political topics, and can get very critical and so on. So how does what you say apply to this range of podcasts that are potentially very powerful? And maybe a last substantive point, right, outside of the podcast itself. You know, your conclusions are really, really very interesting and exciting. And I wonder if it's worth historicizing them a bit in the sense of, say, asking the question whether today's civically active youths differ from previous generations of activists. I'm thinking of, you know, the left in the 50s and 60s, right? Or the new left in the 80s. And then the new left of today, right? Which we sometimes just conflate rather mischievously with a woke generation, right? So what can we disentangle the mess, you know, in the way that we view youth, sometimes very carelessly as kind of unrealistic, overly idealistic, short-term, and so on, right? And kind of disentangle that to really understand the radical potential and the power of youth in each of these generations. I think that would be extremely interesting. So once again, thank you, congratulations, wonderful presentation, loved it.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. If I may, I think based on what Kenneth has commented, as well as some of the questions have come in, I would like to start by asking Jin Yao to address 3 questions that I think broadly reflect both what Kenneth has said, as well as a couple of the early questions in the chat box. So the first one is, who is represented in podcasts? Yeah, and I think Louis Na had a specific addition to that question, which is that there seem not to be a lot of government representatives, or at least representatives of that point of view on your shows. And if you could comment, generally who is represented in podcasts, and including, this particular missing group, that'd be great. Second, a question that I think Kenneth articulated, which I also think is very important, is what can be done in podcasts that can't be done through interviews or focus group discussions. What are the various advantages? And then specifically, I think what are the disadvantages, right, in terms of what people don't say because they're on a public channel rather than in a private interview. And then third, I wanted to shift it a little bit because there are some interesting questions. The last question that Kenneth was talking about youth, that resonates with a question that Cherian also asked, and it's in the chat box, and I'll read that. Cherian says, I was struck by your observation that pro-government, anti-government binary doesn't properly capture the spectrum of young people's attitudes, and that this matches his sense that many engaged young Singaporeans may be much more flexible and strategic in how they decide on whether to work with, against, or apart from officialdom. And Sharon is asking if you have plans to research this more deeply or advice for others who might do so. But perhaps you could comment a little bit more about that specific point you made in your talk. Let's start with those three, and then I think there are more questions, and I will come back.
Yeah, thanks, Kenneth, and thanks everyone. I hope I've been writing down, and I hope I get to most of the questions. If I don't, I'm happy to answer them separately as well. I can answer the advantages and the disadvantages questions together, because in a not so strange way, they are both sides of the same coin, right? The first benefit of it being real time was incidental, so it wasn't planned. So that realization that you could capture sentiments and perspectives in real time, that was something I realized while drafting the manuscript and not while I was conducting it. So I think the implication of that is, in instances in the future when there is a sudden event that's like a disaster or like a pandemic-like situation, that could be one of the potential. I do think the biggest advantage, which I should emphasize further, is that I think the notion of the data or the podcast episodes as being public, as being transparent, is a pretty consistent trend with the move towards open science. So what I mean by that is that anyone can go to the episodes and listen to the episodes, the data themselves, and actually evaluate for themselves whether the analysis I've done and whether the comparisons I've done make sense, right? You can't do that with most forms of interviews and focus group data, right? Because there are concerns over privacy and data being confidential. Then on the other side, that's a disadvantage of it, right? Where as the questions I mentioned, and as you've mentioned, as I've highlighted as well, there's a big selection bias here, because that limits the people who are willing to come on board, right? Because people who are willing to share these opinions without fear or favor are usually folks that are a lot more active already, right? So what this I think translates into is that I see the potential of podcasts as data as being really focused on exploratory questions, right? So they're not going to give definitive answers on processes and patterns that are largely representative of the whole population. But what I've seen from my own work as an extension is that having seen this range and spectrum of involvement and engagement, I can then start investigating in subsequent studies that I'm doing right now to look at these spectrum, right? And which leads to the next question where, in terms of what the range of responses are, because when I first did this, my sensing was that it's not likely to be a dichotomy. Of course, the data largely showed that they coalesce around these two groups, right? Those who are likely to work with the government, those who are likely to campaign for more structural systemic changes. But using this information as well, we did a survey that was a year later from COVID, which we're analyzing the data for right now. And my hunch is that there's likely to be a range of forms of civic and community engagement. And we can actually do that because from the data and from the analysis, in my survey to the youth out there, it will be including a range of different forms of participation and engagement, right? And so that's all to say that the podcast is not going to be definitive as a form of data, right? But it's going to be really helpful, in my opinion, as a exploratory form of data collection right from the start. And I think that's been really instructive in framing how I do subsequent research as well, while being cognizant of the limits. So that's the advantages and disadvantages question. I think in terms of civic engagement and youth participation, political participation in Singapore, there's been a great deal of discourse around it, right? And I and investigating a few other things. I think one of the things that I'm particularly interested in here is the extent to which youth engagement and civic participation is, so the influence of the state in that sense, right? And one big one which I'm studying and which I've been writing on is the fact that school-based volunteerism has been compulsory for a long time. What's interesting there is that the state has articulated the community involvement program, Now Values in Action, as a way to get folks involved and engaged in knowing about the community. But at the same time, there's also been documented history that says that if you look at the statistics for volunteerism amongst young Singaporeans, so there is very high rates of volunteerism between 18 and 24, right? Because between 13 and 24, because that's the age where you're expected to volunteer in school. But once it's no longer compulsory and once they emerge into young adulthood, those who are aged 25 to 34 have one of the lowest volunteerism rates in Singapore, right? So they term it as bathtub volunteerism. So there's high levels, but it goes down significantly thereafter. Obviously, part of it is because you have family commitments and job commitments and all these things. But to me, it's interesting because if you've spent 10 years in primary school and secondary school, you have accrued at least 60 hours of service, right? And yet that doesn't translate into the forms of volunteerism and civic engagement and community engagement we expect to see. And so that's something I've been thinking about in terms of types of school programs, in terms of the types of quality, the types of experiences folks have as well. And that's just the school context, right? If you look in the community as well, there is a spectrum anecdotally in terms of folks being involved in different things, and they run the spectrum of being more progressive or being a bit slow as well. One of the useful designations is that instead of thinking of the dichotomy as well, there was funny enough, there was a podcast I was listening to as well. We like to think of folks as being liberals and conservative, but within those two forms as well, you could have liberals who believe in more conservative forms of change and liberals who believe in more liberal forms of change as well, in terms of the speed, in terms of the types and all these things. And I think it's easy, and dichotomies are easy to kind of make sense of in a research context, but I want to problematize that a little bit further and see what the diverse forms of engagement might be down the road also. And that's something that I want to investigate a bit further. And I guess the final question on who is represented, it's not quite true that only folks who are who mobilize against, no, I wouldn't say mobilize against the state, but who disagree with the state. We do have, we had a member of parliament talk about social work advocacy as well. We have had nominated members of parliament. We've had state affiliated nonprofits talk about their initiatives as well. So we do have kind of a wide range of guests as well. In terms of the audience, they do trend slightly younger. So most of the audience are slightly younger. They're based in Singapore. And from what we know, most of them are social work, social welfare professionals. So they're deeply in tune with the with social policies in Singapore. And one of the metrics that I slightly obsess over is something called the retention rate. So you could track, so let's say episode is 30 minutes long, you can see how many percentage of your audience keeps to 30 minutes, right? So we have pretty good retention rate, about 70 to 80%. So we know folks are listening, but of course, again, that goes back to the selection issue where we know folks who select into listening to these episodes and podcasts are folks who are already interested in those issues. And so, but as I said, it's been growing. So I think that's a good sign that we are slowly but surely growing the audience. They're thinking different ways to expand it, but yeah, those I think is for another conversation. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jin Yao, for your responses. I would like to pose two further questions that come in from the chat box. And I want to say thanks to the audience members for putting in such detailed questions. And even if we don't get to all of them, we'll make sure to send these to Jin Yao later so that he can look at this over his, with good time. So the first question is from Kellen. And it's, again, about methodology and ethics. And she asks, in terms of your own reflexive intervention as podcast editor, writer, and interviewer, what is your process in terms of editing and presenting podcasts? What do you view your role as in producing the interview for the public archive or public consumption? And how does this process compare to curating or presenting data as a researcher in journal articles or more conventional academic forums? So I guess it's a question asking you to reflect a bit on what the different roles you have to play and the different hats you have to wear simultaneously, right? And how you balance that. And the second, I think, is related to something that came up earlier about audience. So if you could say more about this, where where Lorraine asks whether you've tried a more knowledge exchange approach through the podcast platform with your listeners, since you mentioned that podcasts can potentially create an audience and build an engaged community. How do you envision that happening?
Yeah.
I think we have time just for these two questions, so I'll stop there.
I'll answer the second one, and both are really great questions. I think the second one, I keep saying we. I mean, I've co-host now, but really for the last 1.5 years, I've really been doing it myself. So that answers part of the first question, but I'll get to that later. We do see engagement in the forms of, especially with the COVID-19, the 2 seasons I talked about, COVID-19 Community Chronicles and with G 2020, we did get what we call a snowball sampling, like listeners would suggest folks that you should be talking to, that they themselves, if they're running something, was mentioned in manuscripts, that these are folks we also engaged as well. In terms of talking to it, it's not just the podcast, but the newsletter also. So it's a nice way for me to in a monthly basis, summarize. We do about 2 to 3 episodes each month, but we do get engagement from there as well. And I get feedback from folks who might not want to be on episodes, but have suggestions on how we might go about doing things. So something that's fairly recent is talking about and engaging social workers. So far we talked about initiatives and research, making research sense as well. But I don't know if folks know, but last year, I think late last year, there was a slight controversy within the social work space when a member of parliament talked about themes related to professionalization of social work, and social workers have always concerns about how do you distinguish between someone who works in the social service impact space versus someone who's trained as a social worker. So trying to get into some of these discussions that are industry and profession specific, and those are things that have come up based on audience feedback over time also, right? And I think that relates to the first question also, which I think was something that Kenneth mentioned about how much of the self do you involve in. I think that's a really great question, because I will admit that I've not fully reflected on that notion, but what I can say is a few things, right? Number one, it actually reaffirms my belief that researchers and academics have a responsibility and duty to engage with the public. Because what I found is that the skills I've gained and accrued as a qualitative researcher in terms of doing interviews and focus group discussions in the past few years has informed how I run the podcast episodes. Because some of the things seems really obvious, but being more intelligent about asking open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions, being deliberate about having folks describe actions and processes rather than getting them to describe, to ask why questions, right? To get them to describe steps, and then that allows me to follow up from there, right? I think this was best embodied during the G 2020 episodes, because I did have a semi-structured guide, but it was really guided by the interviewers, and I'm letting them guide the discussion. And I don't think these are skills I would have gained if I did not know or wasn't trained in qualitative methodology. And likewise, the work that I do from the public side of it with the episodes and the podcast has also informed the way I do my future research, which I talked about, right? Because these findings and the ways the questions we ask mirror one another as well. The other point I will quickly mention also is it also helps that the two views are similar to one another. So I'm trained as a social welfare folk and social worker, but the episodes as well are about social policy. So there's a lot of overlap. So it's not like I have to wear a completely different hat in that sense as well. So I get plenty of space to reflect and think about the guests also. And in terms of inviting guests, that's quite straightforward. Because I mean, the unfortunate thing in Singapore is that the number of researchers and academics who write publicly, it's not as many as we would expect them to be. So for me, it's really easy, because when someone publishes, this is the first report on suicide in Singapore, first report on homelessness, first report on this, there are so many of these things that are coming out for the first time. And to me, that is something that I want to pick up on. And there is a very small community of folks who are willing to kind of articulate all these things. And so, I think that's something I hope will change over time, but that's made my kind of job in terms of selection easier as well. The social initiatives, I'm just particularly interested in ones that fold in research and also engage the community a lot also. So these are ones that center community members and involve research. And unsurprisingly, this was also framed and forged by my earlier episodes, where I'm realizing that these are key themes that folks who are really engaged in the space do also. So yeah, and I guess the final point will be the number of topics and subject matters are fairly limited in Singapore. So I'm hoping we kind of diversify that a lot more, but for now, it's easy to spot if something is of interest to the public, there's a social issue, and it's easy to pick up on that as well. So that's made my job easier for now, but I hope that changes over time. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. That was a really great discussion, and we are coming to the end of our time today. I want to thank Jin Yao again for sharing his work, and Kenneth for your comments. I also wanted to pick up one final thing about what Kenneth started with, which is to say that it's wonderful to see young scholars combine their research and activism and teaching, yeah, and be willing in our neoliberal university kind of context, you know, to have that be kind of at the forefront, or at least the core and the core of our vocation. So that's wonderful. And it's also very much why Academia SG exists. And why this particular platform exists. So we're really pleased every time we hear work that engages with that kind of ethos. So Jin Yao, I think you can see that there's been a lot of interest in your work. Those of you who have more questions, please reach out to him, sign up for the podcast, keep engaging. And thank you again for coming. If you're interested, or if you haven't heard the other earlier webinars, please check out our website and our YouTube channel, where recordings of earlier webinars are also available. And we do have one other talk coming up in July, on the 22nd of July. And that's Contesting Chineseness, New Chinese Migrants and the Lower Classes in Singapore by Sylvia Ang. So please sign up for that, and we would love to see you again at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.